Director is now in the public domain that he will be stepping down from the home of Zimbabwe's oldest indigenous human rights movement on 31st of December 2025. Can you just take us through your journey?
Yeah, it has been a journey of growth. Like I mentioned in my farewell message, that when I joined, it was a very difficult time. I even mentioned in there that I actually at one point decided to step down on day one. So there were a lot of challenges. This was a time when Zimrise had lost about 80 to 90% of its funding. As a result, donor confidence, particularly in people movements, was shaky. We speak about donor fatigue, but it could be more than that. And as soon as I came in, you may know that was the time when COVID-19 hit us. So 3 months into a new job, there is lockdown. And as you know, Zimrise is a grassroots movement. We organize under trees and things like that. So the $1 million question for me was, how do you run a grassroots movement without meeting the people you're supposed to organize? So it was tough, and we needed to then be able to innovate. And I think looking back 6 years later, I think the journey has been phenomenal. It was also an opportunity for me to grow, and I have learned that leaders, much of the time, their duty is to solve problems. So if you're invited to lead and you find problems, you don't pack your bag and go home. You innovate. That has been my journey.
Okay. We are talking of you surrendering on the 60th day. What was it really all about?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things really. Because I came in as an outsider, so that's succession. Those are some of the succession and transition management dynamics. That when an organization is going through a transition, it has got two choices. It can decide to do internal hiring, which is promotion, or external hiring, which is bringing in an outsider. I came in as an outsider, so there are shocks that you meet as an outsider because this is not an organization that you know. And you never really get to get the full picture unless you are on the ground. So I did underestimate the work that needed to be done and the crisis that we needed to confront. So I mentioned the issue of funding crisis, donor confidence in Zimrise, but at that time I would say generally in people movements. When these elite organizations sprout, there is always the risk that people think they can get quick solutions from elite organizations. And the way that a grassroots movement like Zimrise runs, which is through elections, sometimes that are very messy, it raises in a lot of issues, the contradictions between having a professional secretariat and having a political movement, how to reconcile all those things. You underestimate those things. And also to just put it out there that I was the unlikely candidate to become the director of a human rights movement like Zimrise. I was coming from what I would call a fairly elite organization. Well, I was operating mainly, at very high level international advocacy, national advocacy, without much in terms of grassroots work. And so I was an unlikely candidate for that. So the reality is that when you then ultimately get into the office and you sit on that chair, you then begin to get the full appreciation of the magnitude and the work that is before you. You get a full appreciation of the crisis, the depth in which you are in. And it really looks quite impossible.
We'll come back to the elite and the grassroots organization. But as of now, let's look at the ups and downs. In every journey, there are ups and downs. What have been your downs, your challenges?
Yeah, well, I can say that it was a rich experience. Well, the downside of it is, like I said, when I came in, there was a funding crisis. Donor confidence was rock bottom. The space was shrinking. The priorities for development partners were shifting. And as an outsider, there was need to create buy-in in terms of my new leadership approach. My response to that was to really take time to listen, which is why I joined Zimrights. I started January 2020, but we were only able to launch the strategy, Shifting Power to the People strategy, in March 2022. Why did it take us this long? Is because we really needed, I take part of that as an outsider. I came in as an outsider. So I really needed to spend time to learn and understand the organization. I also needed to have conversations and understand the expectations of the stakeholders. But I also needed to become an insider. So in a way, so you come in as an outsider, you don't have to remain an outsider if you really want to make a difference. So I needed that time to become an insider. It's a leadership principle that people buy into the leader and then into the vision. So if people don't have a relationship with you and you rush to produce a strategy, there's a danger that you probably won't be able to get the buy-in that you need. The other downside, of course, is that we went into COVID-19. So 3 months in, and there is COVID-19. We responded to that by coming up with the digital activism strategy. So it was in 2020 where we launched Zimrights Live, which is a wide array of the digital products. We launched what we call the G11, the group of 11, which are 11 brilliant young people in every Zimrights region who went through intensive training in terms of digital activism strategy. If you've been following the story of Zimrights, that's the time when we became everywhere online. Website was rammed, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We were everywhere, 212 WhatsApp groups. And we started organizing through that space. So those were some of the downs. But in terms of the highs, I think there were more highs than downs. And one of those was really the opportunity that we had to innovate. So you are faced with all these problems, and like I mentioned, many leaders are called in to solve problems. So you find problems there, you don't pack your bag like I had done. You don't pack your bag and leave, but you actually have to innovate. And the highest point, you asked about my highs, the highest point for me was what I now call leadership accompaniment. So I mentioned in my message that true credit really goes to the giants in the shadows who refuse to be credited. Because at that time, there was a group of people from all aspects of civil society, seasoned civic leaders, who came around me as a young leader, and they were prepared to listen to me when I had problems and to help me solve those problems. The current national chairperson of Zimrights was one of those people. Because he leads the political arm of the organization, I lead the professional arm of the organization. The highest part of it is I was an outsider, like I mentioned. And we needed to create buy-in around the vision. And that's where he came in. As a trusted leader, he would sit down with me and say, what is the plan? What do you want to achieve? He asks questions. And once he has that understanding, he is the one who then goes ahead of me to the constituency to be able to explain where we are trying to go. And by the time that I come in, much of the work has already been done. So that idea that there is no table for one in leadership, it is really group work. I hope it doesn't sound like running away from the truth. But that was a high point where my inabilities were really covered up by the people that were around me. Another big high for me for Zim Rights was the People's Human Rights Manifesto, which is what we launched in 2023.
In short, what is it all about?
So the People's Human Rights Manifesto is a human rights-based tool for electoral dialogue between citizens and their leaders. So if you remember, in 2023, no political party produced a manifesto. Some of them, they said, people already know us, our record speaks for itself. What arrogance. But what we then said is that Zimbabweans are tired with a political culture where politicians come and think they know what people want. And they dish that as gifts, which are usually very perishable. So we then said, the people know what they want. So through a number of conversations, we asked people what they want, and they identified 10 things. There were a lot of things, but in conversations, we were able to distill those things to the 10 things, which we called the People's Human Rights Manifesto. And we produced this and invited political leaders from all political parties in Harare Gardens. And they all signed this manifesto, including the current president, who at that time was the candidate for ZANU-PF, and also including the opposition. Then the main opposition was CCC. So they signed up to this manifesto. But what the manifesto does then, it then triggers an accountability process. Because if you go into the manifesto, you will notice for every key ask, there is what we call an action wheel. And that action wheel is grounded in the Constitution. Once it's grounded in the Constitution, and once you have signed up, you then trigger a tracking process where citizens use the red card, the tracking card, to follow every one of those commitments. And in doing so, we unlock a structured dialogue process that allows citizens to have a human rights-based conversation with their leaders. So that was the key thing for me. It was a major highlight because the manifesto became quite a hit with the communities, being able to hold their leaders to account. Another key thing for me is the leadership development process that we started internally. We first started with the secretariat. So like I mentioned, when I joined Zimright, I was more of an outsider. And coming in, I thought we need to develop a culture of leadership internally. When the time comes for a director to leave, people shouldn't scrounge around for a director. Someone must be ready to step in. So we started having internal leadership development programs that I found very enriching, especially for myself. But we then also expanded that to the membership. We introduced what we call the Movement Builders Academy. It will be happening here tomorrow. I think it's the 3rd edition of the Movement Builders Academy, where we identified the key structures of the people's movement. And we then developed their leadership capacities. I spoke earlier on about resilience. What the Movement Builders Academy does is, if for some reason Zimrights works up without a professional secretariat, Zimrights members should be to continue the good work of running the movement. So that comes from the Movement Builders Academy. And we then expanded it.
Has that been empowered?
It's work in progress. Okay. It's work in progress. We expanded it to also go into regional chairpersons. So all the 11 regional chairpersons are part of that leadership development program, because that's where leadership happens, in the communities, in the people. We expanded it to include the National Council. So what that means, earlier on I spoke about the conflict between the movement and the secretariat. What that means is if you have a cross-cutting leadership development and accompaniment program, it means you align the leadership of the secretariat and the leadership of the movement. It means the vision of the organization is shared. And if the leader of the secretariat steps down, there is no fight for 3 years on what it means and where we are going. But it means the vision is aligned. Somebody just steps in and there are no tremors and the organization moves on. If there are changes within the membership, like if the chairperson steps down or there's an election, somebody else steps in because the vision is already shared and there are no tremors in the organization and the organization is able to go forward. If I was to pick one thing from everything at Zimrights, for me, that would be a major highlight.
Okay. And considering that you mentioned about having more donors than when you came in,
Yes.
what could be the secret behind that? Because we are seeing a lot of organizations are folding, or they've already folded during these past months or a few years. What was the secret? What is the secret behind that?
So, if it's important to understand the political context behind these developments. So in 2017, there was a military coup in Zimbabwe, and there was a change of government. A new government that was promising reforms came in, and sadly a lot of donors fell in love with that. They believed that was going to happen, and there was already a lot of shifting in terms of funding. We know a lot of organizations that were doing election monitoring around that time lost their funding overnight, and they were asked to close shop, hand over the vehicles and everything, things like that. So that's just a good example of what was happening within the context at that time, of course, among many other things. But that shift in donor priorities, in political loyalties, caused a lot of organizations to get into tremor. So what happened in January 2025 when Donald Trump withdrew funding? It happened to Zimrights in 2017 and 2018. So you asked me, what is the secret? My view is, when it happened, I think Zimrights was lucky that it happened. Because remember, it happened only to a few organizations. It could have been 3 or 4. That means the entire ecosystem was not disrupted. So if 3 or 4 organizations were struggling, the work were able to continue, as you know, because of Zimrights membership is linked to many of the other organizations. Because of that, it was easy for Zimrights to be able to rebuild, reevaluate. And when I came in 2020, a key thing that I saw in analyzing the sustainability prospects of Zimrights was that about 80 to 90% of Zimrights funding was coming from one donor. So what that means is, if that donor is not happy with you, you are in trouble. So the secret now regarding that is there is need to diversify. The common wisdom of our ancestors, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So part of the task that I was charged with by the leadership of Zimrights was to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of 2018. So we were able to diversify, and by end of 2025, we have 17 different donors. What that simply means is that we're not depending on a single donor. But on top of that, we started pushing, under the shifting power to the people strategy, what is popularly known as community philanthropy. People's struggle must be funded by the people. And we then looked at the math. Zimrights has 250,000 members. So if every member pays their dollar subscription, it means you're able to create $250,000 per year. And Zimrights' operational expenses don't even go that far. It means the Zimrights members are able to fund the operations of their movement. But why was that difficult to achieve? It was difficult and almost impossible to achieve because it costs $5 to collect $2 for a movement that has got 68% of its membership in the rural areas without access to the usual banking facilities. So that then created a problem for us. But we then started innovating using technology. I spoke about digital activism. We then introduced a platform that allows our members to be able to pay their subscriptions through a WhatsApp, through an SMS, and it's systems that we're currently trying. And my hope is that whoever takes over from me will be able to continue to build on that. And that's what we call community philanthropy. Because the same people who are members of Zimrites, every Sunday there is a church they go to. Yeah. And when they arrive at church, they don't ask for a refund. They actually give the pastor money to build an expensive mansion. What has changed? It's a mindset. When they come to Zimrites, do they feel they own the movement and they need to invest in it? Or when they see those big logo donors, they say, we probably need some of that money. But community goes beyond those grassroots organizers, the Zimrites members. Who is your neighbor? Who are the businesses that are operating in the area that you are operating? Which is why last week we convened the golf tournament, in which we invited the business community that deals with Zimrites every day. Where do we do our banking? Where do we do our stationery? Where do we do? And we said, you are already human rights defenders because your work is going into the work of Zimrites. Why don't we build this community and break the stigma that the real human rights defenders are only those who are carrying a Zimrites card, who are shouting Zimrites slogans and things like that. But the human rights defenders go beyond that. And when we appreciate that, it means we are building community philanthropy. It's not in big things. I can give you an example. The water that we drink here at Zimrites is being pumped into here by a local business. So we're not paying for that water. It's water that a business is donating to Zimrites. And that's a good example of community philanthropy. So when we look at all those things, for me, that's the secret to the future of human rights groups, at least for movements like Zimrites. The people must be able to fund their own movement.
What could be your advice to some of these organizations?
So I did speak to say the funding freeze that happened earlier this year it affected all organizations because the ecosystem was disrupted. But the organizations that are rising still, as our annual report says it. And what sets the difference between those organizations and those that may not be able to continue. One is the principle of longevity. It's important for an organization as it continues to learn about itself, the difficulties that they face, and be able to improve from there. So Zimrites has been around for 33 years, 34 years. And over those years, there are things that we have learned that allow us to be able to navigate this kind of crisis. But one other thing that you'll find in Zimrites and some similar organizations is that you will notice that our cost of doing business is really low, right? So Zimrites is not a flashy organization, meaning to say we need very little money to do so much because we have learned to be in plenty, we have learned to be in want. As a result, my advice to organizations, sometimes where you are used to be driving a double cab, turn it down. If you came into the car park, you may have seen a Datsun Go. Those are some of the things that we have done, and we call it a sustainability vehicle because it costs $30 to go to Rumba with that vehicle. So those are some of the adjustments that I encourage organizations to do. We have done that because we've been in the wilderness for quite a while. But also, in addition to that, I would encourage, building relationships with the community where you operate, investing in long-term, high-impact projects. This is Zimrites House. it belongs to Zimrites. So come rain, come thunder, Zimrites will always have a place to operate from. If they can't pay the secretariat, the members can come and sit here where I'm sitting. In fact, it has happened for 10 years. Where the secretariat closed down, went home, and the members. So one of the key lessons for a movement is you need to have long-term infrastructure. We learn that in all movements. A good example of a movement is the Catholic Church. It's a movement. And what is their greatest strength? They have infrastructure. You hate them, you will go to their hospitals. You hate them, you will go to their schools. The same principle applies to movements like Zimrites. You need to have your infrastructure in place. So we inherited this Zimrites house, which has continued to become an anchor. We have recently acquired another property in Masungu, where we are building another Zimrites house. And there are a lot of other projects that are in the way. And my advice is that instead of paying $150,000 per year in expensive rentals in upmarket suburbs, organizations must look at ways of how they can invest that money in much more long-term infrastructure projects so that their movements can have solid grounding. What that simply tells you is that you are investing for the future. You are not just looking at today, but you are looking way into the future, and the next generations will really be grateful.
And maybe take us through how you ended up landing the post of in the International Federation for Human Rights. We understand your chairperson appointed the vice president. What is it all about?
Yeah, so this is part of the work that I said, in my farewell message. I really paid tribute to my predecessors, that they built a solid foundation. So the relationship with the International Federation for Human Rights has been deepened over successive leaders. During my tenure, that's when our national chairperson was elected vice president. And there's an important lesson there for movements. One is that if you are the secretariat of a movement, you are not the movement. So this business of seeing the director everywhere, it means the real people on the ground are being left out. So the way we have structured, and I found it like that, I didn't structure it, the way Zimrites was structured is that those solidarity platforms, global solidarity, regional solidarity, FIDH, SADC People Summit, African Commission, the priority is for a representative of the membership. That means if we have money for one ticket, I'm not the one who goes. It's not the secretary who goes. But it's a person from the membership, either the chairperson or their delegate. Because these are the people who are doing the real work on the ground. And because they have been participating consistently, they were able to build a strong reputation for Zimrites across the Africa region. Because FIDH, we are talking about global. So it means for him to become the vice president, it means there are people from the Africa region who needed to vote for him. There are people from the Americas who needed to vote for him. There are people from Asia who needed to vote from him. There are people from Europe who needed to vote from him. So the secret to that was consistency, right? Zimrites, Baba, is consistent. I think in the Catholic Church they say, Zimrites has always been consistent in terms of its messaging. And as a result, when the name was put before to say, who do we put in place to represent at that kind of level, Zimrites was a no-brainer. As a result, our national chairperson became the vice president, which is a historic feat for Zimrites. But beyond that, it's not just about that kind of...
For Zimbabwe.
It's for Zimbabwe. It's for Zimbabwe. Beyond that, We have also, together with FIDH and other partners around the world, produced some excellent human rights products, which includes the State of Civics PES report. And we have been consistent at the African Commission for hosting what is called the Zimbabwe Solidarity Dinner. Every year, we gather Africans from all over the world to come and meet and listen to the stories from Zimbabwe. We launch a report at that event, and we tell them what solidarity we expect from them. And they then build their own movements to support our solidarity. So in a nutshell, I would think it is because of that work that Zim Rights was recognized globally.
In the locally, we see that you have been given a farewell piece by ZPP. Mm-hmm. Are you also involved in these local NGOs? How?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that Zim Rights is the first post-independence indigenous human rights advocacy group. That means before every other locally driven human rights group was, Zim Rights was. And the mission for Zim Rights was very clear in 1992. To remove Zim Rights from being an abstract concept to an everyday people concept. As a result, more than 250,000 people across the country are Zim Rights members. The chance of you just walking to a person in the street and they are most likely a Zim Rights member is very high than not. As a result, human rights were a difficult subject. People were afraid, and Zim Rights was able to destigmatize them and make people very proud to be human rights defenders. The result for that is that anyone who wanted to do Zim Rights work, to do human rights work, when they went into the communities to look for vigilant people to help them organize, the people who stood up were Zim Rights members. That meant if an organization wanted to go into election monitoring, they needed election observers, and they needed to be people who are fearless, and they turned out to be Zim Rights members. If an organization needed to do violence monitoring, they needed citizens who are fearless, and they turned out to be Zim Rights members. As a result, Zim Rights became a key player in the foundation of most of the human rights organizations in Zimbabwe. Now, that's a fact. And one of those organizations is the Zimbabwe Peace Project, where today Zim Rights has more human rights monitors than any other organization. And we are part of that coalition with 6 other organizations. As we are in the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum with other 21 organizations, Zimbabwe Election Support with many other organizations. So Zim Rights is like an octopus, I would say. It's all over the place. And when I joined in 2020, as Zim Rights was a member of ZPP, I was elected to join the board of ZPP, 2020, 2021. Then in 2022, I was then elected to become the chairperson of ZPP. And like I mentioned, a lot of organizations were going through different crises, and ZPP was also going through its own crisis. And we were able to work with the members of ZPP throughout the next 3 years. And today, since I also announced that I'm leaving Zim Rights, it means I'm also stepping down from my role at ZPP. So the board members and the members of ZPP are the ones who then come together to say they want to express their appreciation for the role that we played in strengthening that institution, particularly going through transition. They went through a leadership transition, and leadership transitions are not easy in civil society. They need to be managed carefully. And ZPP is one of the few organizations that successfully did that without compromising the brand. And for that, the ZPP community was very grateful. But for me, it's simply because of the strong foundations that our predecessors have laid that Zim Rights has itself become a trusted brand.
And then maybe, you know, when someone announces that he or she is leaving, I think there are a lot of speculations around that. Can you put those speculations to rest? What are you going into?
Yeah, so I am not leaving because I found a job somewhere. I'm leaving as a matter of principle. I've led Zimrites for 6 years now, and I think I've played my part. I had wanted to make it 5 years. The board asked me to add another year to that. So right now, what I think I will do is I will probably get a fellowship and then withdraw to rest. You know, human rights work is difficult. We face all sorts of things. And I think it's an opportunity for me to also reflect, maybe write a bit. I love writing, so I might find myself writing, as well as, thinking about the future in terms of what I would like to do.
But for now, yeah.
For now, I'm a free man. If you have a job, I'm ready to take it. As long as it is not becoming a director of a human rights organization.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe lastly, I would want to maybe to shed more light on the human rights situation in Zimbabwe. Vana vanoti vashoma basa rakawanda. Is it the same with the human rights work?
It is actually the same. So the human rights situation in Zimbabwe, as you know, is affected by political developments. Usually, if there are elections, we know that human rights violations increase. Right now, we are not in an election mode, but there are political developments that are triggering what I would call a human rights crisis, particularly the issues to do with possible changes to the constitution that might seem to undo some of the work that have been done. Resolution number 1 by ZANU-PF has not been received very well by the generality of the people, because it's basically a threat to constitutionalism. And a lot of the people that we have been speaking to, in terms of principle, not politics, in terms of principle, we have an obligation as leaders. I'm talking of political leaders. When they take an oath of office, they take that oath to defend the Constitution. I am glad that the president has put himself on record to say that he is a constitutionalist. And I think that's the challenge that political leaders have, to prove, to go beyond words, that they are constitutionalists. So that's been a trigger in terms of human rights. We're beginning to see an increase in violence, intra-party violence, hate speech. We're seeing an increase in hate speech, and we're also seeing groups that are opposed to the 2030 being subjected to harassment. We had the Sapes Trust being burnt down, and we had Tendai BT reporting that their people are being followed. We have got some members who have already gone into hiding because they dare speak in their communities. So that has triggered what I think is a human rights crisis, almost to the same proportions as if we were in an election year. The second human rights issue that we are dealing with and that we are tracking is the civic space, which has been triggered by the PVO Act. Zimrites is already a PVO, and we are not directly affected in the sense that we are compliant. But the human rights ecosystem depends on a lot of other actors who are negatively affected by the PVO Act. And the major problem with the PVO Act is the hate speech that has accompanied it, that seems to brand NGOs as enemies of the state. Now, the PVO Act is going to create criminal liabilities for leaders of the NGOs. And a lot of community-based organizations depend on volunteers, even for leadership positions. For you to be in the board under the PVO Act, you need to have at least 7 board members. But if the law says you will be imprisoned for 1, 2, 3, it means more organizations find it difficult to get those volunteers to stand on their boards, and a lot of self-censorship begins to happen. So it then creates a crisis where organizations that usually step in for the people in terms of issues to do with governance, accountability, and human rights begin to step back because of this kind of law. So that's the second kind of, so those two issues, I think, are creating a human rights crisis for Zimbabwe.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and everything.